So let's just back up a little bit. We had talked about yesterday in the Likutim about a case where a man agrees, Reuven agrees to lend Shimon $10,000 and tells him, write up the promissory note, get it all documented properly, have the witnesses do a kinyan so that you've created a lien on your property, and then bring it over and I'll give you the cash. Shimon does all of that, comes to Reuven's doorstep. Reuven said, I'm sorry, can't lend you the money. So what's the halacha in that situation? So some poskim say that as long as Reuven had already committed himself to it, he can't back out once he's got put Shimon through all that. But there are other poskim who say that he does have a legal right to back out, even though we might say that he's a mechusar amana, he's acting in bad faith, and he's a bad person for having put Shimon through that. Sometimes there could be legitimate situations where Reuven had every good intention of lending the money, and unfortunately something happened, an emergency occurred. And so therefore there is a legal right for Reuven to back out, at least according to some poskim, and therefore Shimon has no reprisal. However, the cost, and ulam schar hasofer shahotzi Shimon sheyachin lo hashtar zechai Reuven l'shalom lo medina degarmi. The last thing we saw is that Shimon can definitely demand compensation for the cost that he incurred in drawing up, drafting the papers, whether it's the scribal fee or whether it's the sofer fee or any other, or the lawyer fee or any other fees that he's incurred in order to take out this loan. He is entitled to compensation. Okay. Now, we are going to start the next sif, which is Yud Tes. So up until now, we've been discussing the possibility of drawing up papers that create a debt or a liability for Shimon in Shimon's presence without Reuven, the creditor, being present. That, we said, it will all depend on whether the Eidim are acting as proxies for Reuven to create that debt in Reuven's favor, or whether they're doing it independently of Reuven. If they're doing it independently of Reuven, and then there could be a problem of a predated lien, because the lien doesn't begin until the paper gets into the hands of the creditor. But if they do it as proxies, if they do it as shalichim of Reuven, then it could be a legally enacted document, even though the creditor Reuven is not present. Now we're going to deal with the opposite issue, which is, can you ever draw up liability papers, like a promissory note, in the absence of the debtor, and just do it while the creditor is present? So that, the Rav Shulchan Aruch says, Aval ein kosvin shum shtar chov lemalve ad sheyeh halo ve'imo. You cannot do that. You cannot draw up paper because a malva says to two witnesses, I'm planning to lend $10,000 to Shimon. I want to make sure that the promissory note is in order. So please draw up the promissory note that Shimon owes me $10,000. So they can't draw that up and certainly not sign it. I mean, you can draw up papers to that effect, but you can't make it legally binding papers, like by having the witnesses sign that. Ad sheyeh halo ve'imo, unless the debtor is present. Afilu kvar kanu miyad halova b'kinyan surah mitchila. And this is true even if previously Shimon had already agreed that he was going to be indebted for $10,000 to Reuven, even if he made a kinyan with the witnesses present that he was going to be chayiv to pay Reuven $10,000. Shelo bifnei miyad halova b'kinyan surah mitchila shelo bifnei hamalva, if it was done in the malva's absence. In other words, let's say they had met with Shimon privately, and he had made a kinyan with them that I'm going to owe, but with this kinyan, I hereby have a debt now to Reuven for $10,000. they can't later go to the malva and the malva says to them, draw a paper to that effect. Shehu chayiv l'malva zelafi she'ein omrim stam kinyan l'ksiva omed kishakana miyado shelo bifnei hamalva. He says the reason is because there was never an agreement expressly that this debt would be recorded on paper. And there's no tacit assumption that the debt is meant to be recorded on paper, unless both parties are present. And vafilu im omer hamal v'la'edim kisvu hashtarcho v'chismuhu v'yiyu b'yedcha. So therefore, that's the reason why, if the lova just made a kinyan with them and said, with this kinyan, I hereby owe $10,000 to Ruvain, the witnesses cannot draw that up as a legally binding promissory note unless the debtor tells them to, unless the debtor makes it clear that that's what he wants. So therefore, if they're now in the creditor's presence without the debtor being present, without Shimon being present, afilu im omer hamal v'la'edim kisvu ashtarcho v'chismu v'yiyah b'yedchem. Even if the creditor says to them, listen, guys, I understand your hesitation to draw up this promissory note because Shimon is not present. Why don't you draw it up, sign it, and hold on to it? And you don't have to give it to me until you get Shimon's approval. And only after Shimon comes forward, he's coming later today. You'll see him later today. When he comes forward, you'll ask him, is it okay for us to give this promissory note to Reuven? And once he tells you yes, then you can give it to me. V'im lav tikra'uhu. And if not, you can tear up the promissory note. In other words, he goes through with them and tells them, I'm not telling you to give me the promissory note. You hold it in escrow, and I can't use it, right? Until you get permission from the lova, from the debtor. Nonetheless, the Rav Shulchan Aruch says, lo yishma'u lo. They should not listen to him until they hear expressly from the debtor that he wants the promissory note drawn up. They have no right to do it, even if they know that the debtor owes the money. Why? Because there is a difference between loans that are drawn on notes and loans that are oral, right? One basic difference is, can you seize assets from encumbered property? Can you collect from property that I've already sold off? So, and the reason why they can't listen to the creditor in this case is ulai marimu. Maybe he has a plot, this creditor, that maybe he figures, well, they'll hold on to it, but I'll figure out some way to slip in and get it from them. Maybe they'll lose the shtarchov, maybe they'll lose the note, and he'll be able to find it. Oshema yignavenu mehem, or maybe he'll steal it from them. Which is a very unusual kind of statement, right? That we would suspect another Jew of doing something underhanded. But apparently, we're not supposed to give an opportunity for anybody. Yeah, right. Now, like I said, can they draw a paper without signing it? Of course, but they shouldn't sign. Basically, the witnesses shouldn't sign the document until they know for sure that the debtor wants this to be recorded in a contract. Now, let's turn the tables. Similarly, witnesses are not permitted to write a shovar. Now, a shovar is a receipt. That's literally what the word shovar means. It means that when Shimon is a debtor and he pays back a debt, so there are two ways to be done with all of the paperwork. One way is to tear up the promissory note. You give the promissory note back to the debtor, he tears it up. Done. No more ability to collect. But there's another way of doing it, which is to write a receipt to the debtor, which basically says paid in full, right? The witnesses should not write a receipt for the lova saying that he's paid back his debt in full, ad sheyehi hamalva imo, until the malva is present, until the creditor is present. We'll see why. Aval kosvin v'chosmin shover lamalva, afal pi she'ein halova imo. But what they are allowed to do is they are allowed to write a receipt to the malva, even though the lova is not present. Now, that's a little bit strange. They can basically give a receipt to the malva saying that the debt was paid in full, even though the lova is not present, because it's only an asset to the lova, and it'll be up to the malva to decide whether to give that receipt to the lova. So we're going to go through this last part together. We'll go through it inside in the Imrei Yaakov. Let's go back. So we're talking about the standard example in this case is a debt. Okay, so let's take a look. Ein kosvin shum shtar chov shelo bifnei hamalva. Cannot draw up a promissory note unless it's in the one second. Well, he's going perish ksiva v'chasima. This whole halacha is talking about drawing it up and signing it. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with drawing up a piece of paper that says that has the language of the promissory note, as long as the witnesses don't sign it. Malva v'chulei wrote Salomar aval imkanu bifnei hamalve rishoim lichto v'limser lamalve kidle'el seif yud ayin sham. But what we did see is if the debt was generated and a kinyan was made in the presence of the malva, then it's implicit that there is a desire to draw up paper. And we saw this back in Sif Yud. Let me just see if I can get it, bring it up. Back in Sif Yud, hold on a second. I just have to bring up the old file in the PDF. Hold on. Oh, this was a very long Sif. Okay. So we had said, you go back to Sif Yud. Wow. Whoa. Here we go. Hamalves chaveru be'edim. Lo yichtavu edusam v'yitnu lamalves shalom midas halova. If a person lends money to a debtor, the witnesses should not draw up that note, that debt, and give the promissory note to the malva without the lova's consent. Kishema ein ritzono shalova shi lamalva shtar chovalav. Because maybe the debtor does not wish for there to be a promissory note to record that debt, like we said before, because in that way he'll be able to collect from encumbered property. But that's only when no kinyan was made from the lova. Aval im kanu miyadu shalova bifnei hamalva. But if in the presence of the malva there was a kinyan that the witnesses made with the lova, that he's generating a debt to the malva, the kinyan suitor using the kinyan chalip and using the handkerchief, afilu lo hilva lo klum, ella shehikna lo bekinyan suitor shuhu chayiv lo mana, and even though they saw no exchange of cash, but they did see that the lova is generating the debt with a kinyan, arei ha'edim rashai lichto v'lachtom v'litein liyad zeh sheniz chayiv lo, then the witnesses are permitted, because he's done it in the presence of the malva. Afal pi shahaniz chayiv lo amar lahem lichto, even though there was no express instruction to the witnesses to draw a paper. And the reason is that in this situation is lefisha stam kinyan leksiva omeid ela imkain hamischayev mochem lichto. He says when a kinyan is done in the presence of the creditor, then it's assumed that they wish to record this on paper. Okay, it's assumed that all parties wish to record this on paper unless the lova actively protests. Okay, and this can be done they can even draw up the paper even after a few weeks after the kinyan was made. But as long as the kinyan was made in the presence of both parties, there's an assumption that there's a desire to draw a paper for that. Now contrast that with this halacha, and in this halacha, it's just the it's just the opposite. Where in Sif Yud Tes, what we're essentially saying is that if it's only the lova present and he's made the kinyan with the edim, then it's altogether possible that he does not want paper drawn up. Okay, so this subtle difference of whether the creditor is present makes all the difference in halacha as to whether there's an implicit endorsement of drawing up a promissory note. Okay. All right. So therefore, right. So that was an important reference. Okay. Let's go on. Shalo bifnei hamalve, kain piresh b'shulchan aruch. That in this situation, that you should not, if the lova, the debtor made a kinyan in the absence of the creditor, then even though he made the kinyan and generated the debt in front of witnesses, we don't assume automatically that he wants paper drawn. But he says v'yesh cholkim. Imrei Yaakov says that there are those who disagree with the Shulchan Aruch. This is the opinion of the Rama, and he says that no, anytime a debt is generated in front of witnesses, even if it's in the absence of the creditor, it is the desire. It is understood that paper will be drawn up. Now, according to the Shulchan Aruch's opinion, which is what the Rav Shulchan Aruch is siding with, we have to think about this. In mikol makom govim mimishubadim dekala islahu kevin dekanu o deikar hakol toloi b'ksiva. He says, what if we paskin like the Shulchan Aruch, right? This is what we're saying, and you don't draw up paper. Does the malva still have a right to collect his debt from encumbered property? Or do we say that the only time you can collect from encumbered property is if there was a contract? Now, what difference does a contract make in your ability to collect from encumbered property? It's very simple. The whole reason why you're allowed to collect from encumbered property is because a person who purchases real estate has to do what we call in today's parlance a title search. What is a title search? He's got to do his due diligence to find out if there's any lien on this property. How do you determine if there's a lien on a property? Usually it's through asking around, because in those days they didn't have a national or local municipal registry of land ownership. So like we have today, a land registry would very easily document whether there's a lien on this property, whether this property is encumbered by a debt or something like that. So the question is, what is reasonable for a purchaser when doing their due diligence in the absence of a land registry? Do we say that it's possible for a purchaser to discover that there's a lien on this property by virtue of the fact that there was a loan made, that Shimon the seller borrowed money, even without a shtar? Or do we say that the only way that we can expect purchasers to be able to do their due diligence is if there was a loan that was made with paper? Because paper involves a more public process. They can track down the local scribe and they can find out. Tell me about over this past year, did you ever draw up a document for this guy Shimon who I want to buy a piece of property from. And if the sofer will be able to tell them. So that's the deliberation. Can a creditor who is owed money by Shimon, but it's not, and a kinyan was made, there was clearly witnesses to the event of the generation of the debt, but there was no paper drawn up. Can the creditor now collect from the purchasers who purchased this property after the debt was generated or not? He says, O de ikar hakol taloi biksiva. Do we say that the ability for a potential purchaser to do their due diligence is dependent upon the drawing up of a draft, or is it just by virtue of the fact that the loan was made? The kaven de'ein lahem reshus lichtov lo mafki lakala va'ain ma shekosafti b'biurim le'el sif yud devri hamaschal imkanu v'tzarchim. He says it's not so clear, but certainly because the din is not clear, the purchasers would probably be able to prevent the property from being confiscated in Beis Din. We're usually using Reuven as the lender. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Collateral. Yeah.
So then, if Shimon then sold property, could Reuven show that collateral to say that was why he should be paid from that money?
Well, usually the collateral should be equal or of greater value than the debt. So there's no need for Reuven to collect from real estate. He can just keep the collateral. That would act as his payment.
Maybe I get a loan and I don't want to put everybody knows about the loan. So how is that?
The whole function of drawing up paper is to publicize an event. In other words, it really serves two functions. Number one, it gives the creditor the legal evidence that he needs in order to collect in Beis Din, but it also provides a certain publicity to an event, such that if a person wants a third party, an innocent third party wants to protect themselves from getting involved in encumbered property, they're able to do that. So a sofer can't say, I don't reveal the names of my clients. Right? He doesn't have a right to. Right? There is no sofer client privilege.
Land registry. The land registry office.
The land right? It's like going to the land registry office and saying, I'd like to do a title search on the property, and they say, well, we don't give out names. Okay, next. Va'afilu im oimer hamalve, and this is true. Now, what do we say over here? Even if the malva were to say to the witnesses, guys, the lov is not present. The witnesses know that he's borrowed the money, he's generated a debt, but they haven't heard from him expressly to draw up paper. The malva then tells them privately, without the lova being present, guys, you know that he owes me the money. Just draw up the paper. You hold it in escrow, and when you hear from the lova that you can give me the paper, you'll give me the paper. So the Rav Shulchan Aruch says, don't listen to him. Don't listen to him. He says, Mashma degam beika tarti lamal yusa. Dekanu miyad halova bekinyan so sudar. Rakaya shelo bifnei amalvas. This means that even if everything was done correctly, which the witnesses witnessed the lova making a kinyan, generating his debt to the malva, just in the absence of the malva. V'chein shamalva omer lahem, she'iyah biyadam ad she'omer lahem aloy v'litno li. And the malva even tells them, you guys hold on to the promissory note. Don't give it to me. Just hold on to it. B'kol makom ein kosmin. They're still not allowed to draw it up. But the Tumim, Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz feels that there's nothing wrong with writing it. Whereas once the witnesses clearly know that the debt was generated, they know that that Shimon owes the $10,000 to Reuben, and they're willing to hold on to the paper, and they're not going to give it to the Malva until they get Shimon's express permission to give it to him. Then there's absolutely nothing wrong with them drawing up this paper. Okay, ein kosman b'chosman shover lelove. Another thing that they're not supposed to do is they're not supposed to write a receipt for the love saying that payment has been made in full. Hainu, af imhu omer lahem sheyishaer etzlam hashover ad zman hapiro. Now here we're talking about a case where the witnesses have not witnessed the payback. Okay, they haven't seen the lova pay back the money, but the lova says, guys, I'm getting ready to pay back my debt to Ruvain, and I want to have a receipt that you will be able to give me. So do me a favor, draw up the paper, sign it for such and such a date, and when you actually witness me paying back the money, then give me the paper. But you hold it in escrow, right? He says that's another example of where they shouldn't draw a paper. You're not, the bottom line rule is never draw up paper with a witness's signature to an event that you're not sure has happened, even if you're going to hold on to it. And the reason is because you never know what might happen to that paper. It could get into the wrong hands. So that's the general rule. And even though it's what we're concerned about is that someone will act nefariously, but I guess because of the fact that you're signing something that you don't know is actually legitimate, you're not allowed to sign it. And this is why Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz makes much more sense. He says, even in a case where you know that the debt was generated, and it's only a question of, does the lova really want there to be paper or not? But you know that debt does exist. So you're not signing anything incorrect. You're not signing anything false. You're just generating paper to act as evidence to a debt that you know is real, but you just don't know whether the debtor is going to approve of the evidence of drafting it. So there, Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz says, since everything that you're signing is true and you know it's true, then you have every right to draw up that paper. But just hold on to it until you get the lova's permission that you can deliver it to the malva. But the Rav Shulchan Aruch disagrees. He feels that no, even that you're not supposed to do because you didn't get the permission expressly from the lova that he wants there to be paper to record this debt. Okay? All right, so I think that we'll hold it here for today. There's a long biurim over here, which I think we'll just take a look at in Mirz Hashem tomorrow. He's going to talk about whether there's an advantage to having a handwritten document or whether you can use a printed document and fill in the blanks. All right, take care, everybody.